He stood in the cold mud, clutching a cheap paper title for 17 rusted, rotting cars. She stood on the dry pavement in $3,000 shoes, laughing at him. She called him a fool for throwing away a month's rent on dead metal. 30 days later, she wasn't laughing. The rain in Portland didn't fall so much as it hovered, a heavy, misting dampness that soaked through wool and seeped into the bones. Vivian Croft sat in the back of her idling Mercedes Maybach, the heated leather pressing gently against her spine. The cabin smelled faintly of expensive cedarwood oil and the sterile, recycled air of the climate control system. Outside the tinted glass, an abandoned industrial lot spread out like a concrete graveyard. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the leather armrest. "How much longer, David?" Her assistant, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced at his tablet. "The auctioneer is just finishing the chattels, Miss Croft. Once the physical debris is cleared, we secure the deed to the land." 5 minutes. Vivian sighed. It was a formality. Her logistics firm, Croft Omnicorp, needed this 10-acre plot for a new automated distribution hub. The land itself was prime real estate, situated perfectly near the highway interchange. The only problem was the garbage currently sitting on it. She opened the door and stepped out. The cold air bit at her cheeks. Her heels, imported Italian leather, clicked against the broken asphalt before sinking slightly into a patch of oil-slicked mud. She grimaced, instantly regretting leaving the car, but she hated waiting. Time was a metric she controlled, and today it felt like it was slipping. A small crowd of a dozen people stood huddled beneath a corrugated metal awning, listening to the auctioneer drone on through a crackling bullhorn. They were a mix of scrap metal buyers, local liquidators, and bottom feeders in heavy work boots and faded flannel. Vivian stood at the edge of the awning, her tailored camel hair coat a stark anomaly in the sea of damp canvas and denim. "All right, lot 42, the auctioneer rasped, wiping rain from his forehead. 17 derelict vehicles, sold as a single lot. No keys, no guarantees. Title is salvage. Buyer is responsible for removal by Friday. Let's start the bidding at scrap weight. Do I hear $1,000? Vivian looked at the vehicles. They were tucked against the collapsed chain-link fence, partially covered by decaying blue tarps. They looked like swollen, blocky minivans, covered in some sort of peeling, off-white fiberglass molding. The tires were flat, melting into the mud. Moss grew thick over the window seals. The smell of rotting rubber and stagnant water hung heavy in the air. To Vivian, they weren't just junk, they were a testament to failure. Someone's bad business idea left to rot. 1,000, grunted a heavy-set man in a high-vis vest, a local scrapper. 1,500, another voice called out. Vivian turned her head. The voice belonged to a man standing near the edge of the awning. He looked to be in his late 30s, though the deep lines around his eyes suggested harder miles. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, stained black at the cuffs with grease. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, but Vivian could see the white knuckles. He smelled faintly of stale diner coffee and WD-40, a sharp metallic odor that cut through the damp earth smell of the lot. 2,000, the scrapper countered, throwing a dirty look at the man. 2,500, the man in the canvas jacket said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly tight. A voice pushed through a constricted throat. The scrapper spat into the mud and shook his head. Too much fiberglass to strip. Not worth the weight. You can have the garbage, Artie. 2,500 going once, twice. Sold to Jonathan Paul, the auctioneer said, moving immediately to the next sheet of paper. Vivian let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't meant to be loud, but in the quiet damp of the morning, it carried. Jonathan turned. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met hers. There was a raw exhaustion in his face, the kind of deep-seated fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. He looked at her immaculate coat, her flawless hair, and the imposing black SUV idling behind her. Vivian stepped forward, unable to help herself. She had built her empire by cutting out inefficiency, by recognizing worthless assets and liquidating them. Looking at this man, clearly struggling, clearly pouring money he didn't have into literal garbage, offended her sensibilities. "Congratulations on your purchase, Mr. Paul," Vivian said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "Though, I have to ask, why on earth would you spend $2,500 on 17 tetanus traps? The towing alone will bankrupt you." Jonathan didn't blink. He looked down at her mud-splattered heels. "They have good bones." "Bones?" Vivian smiled, a thin, razor-sharp curve of the lips. "They're rotting fiberglass and rust. You just bought a liability. It's decisions like this that keep people exactly where they are." It was a cruel thing to say, but Vivian believed in cruelty if it was true. She thought she was giving him a dose of reality. She expected him to flush with anger, maybe yell. Instead, Jonathan just stared at her. He didn't look angry. He looked at her the way a seasoned mechanic looks at a broken bolt, with quiet, accepting exhaustion. "You need the lot cleared by Friday," Jonathan said quietly. "They'll be gone by Thursday night." He turned and walked away, his boots heavy in the gravel. Vivian watched him go, a momentary flicker of irritation passing through her. She hated when people didn't recognize their own foolishness. "Clear the deed," she told David, turning back to the warmth of her car. "And make sure security locks the gates on Friday. If he leaves a single rusty fender behind, I want him sued for disposal costs." The sound of the winch was a high-pitched, mechanical scream that echoed off the cinder-block walls of the alleyway. Jonathan stood in the freezing rain, operating the heavy steel lever on the back of a flatbed tow truck. His best friend, Greg, was beneath the rear axle of one of the fiberglass monstrosities, swearing loudly as muddy water dripped directly into his eyes. "Chains secure," Greg yelled, rolling out from under the chassis on a plastic creeper that ground loudly against the loose gravel. He stood up, wiping oily grit from his face. "Artie, I swear to God, if this winch snaps and takes my head off, you're adopting my dog." "It'll hold," Jonathan muttered, pushing the lever. The heavy steel cable went taut. The rusted vehicle groaned. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like tearing canvas, the flat, dry, rotted tires broke free from the mud they had been married to for 15 years. The vehicle dragged itself up the ramp of the flatbed, protesting every inch of the way. It was Wednesday night. They had been moving cars for 36 hours straight, shuttling them from Vivian Croft's newly acquired lot to a cheap, unpaved storage yard Jonathan had rented behind a failing strip mall. The storage rent was $600. The tow truck rental, heavily discounted by Greg, was another $400. The auction cost was $2,500. Jonathan's bank account currently held $38.14. He locked the winch and wiped his freezing hands on his jeans. The knuckles on his right hand were split and bleeding from a slip of a heavy wrench earlier that morning. The blood mixed with the black grease, drying into a tight, stinging crust. Sitting in the passenger seat of Jonathan's beat-up pickup truck parked nearby was his 7-year-old son, Toby. The engine was running to keep the heater on. Toby was asleep, his head resting against the glass, breath fogging the window. A faint wheeze accompanied every exhalation. Toby's asthma inhalers were $70 a month. The rent on their cramped 2-bedroom apartment was due in 9 days. Jonathan felt a physical weight press down on his chest. It felt like a cinder block resting directly on his sternum. He had drained his entire emergency fund. He had gambled the thin margin of safety that separated his family from homelessness on a hunch. "All right, that's number 12, Greg said, leaning against the flatbed and lighting a cigarette. The tip glowed bright orange in the gloom. Only 5 more of these ugly bastards to go. Seriously, Artie, what the hell are these? They look like ice cream trucks that gave up on life." Jonathan walked over to the side of the vehicle. The exterior was a hideous, blocky fiberglass shell, designed to look like a generic safari tour bus. The fiberglass was cracked, revealing faded yellow paint underneath. He pulled a pocket knife from his belt and wedged the blade into a deep crack in the fiberglass wheel arch. He twisted hard. A chunk of the brittle, off-white shell snapped off, clattering to the wet asphalt. Beneath the ugly aftermarket shell was solid steel. Rust-spotted, yes, but heavy and curved. In the late 90s, a company in Florida tried to start a luxury swamp tour business, Jonathan said softly, his thumb running over the exposed steel. It felt cold, rigid, and real. They bought up a fleet of old vehicles, welded these fiberglass shells over them to make them look uniform, and parked them out back. The company went bankrupt before they launched. The bank seized the assets and shipped them up here to liquidate, but they lost the paperwork. They've been sitting under a tarp for 2 decades. Okay, History Channel. Greg blew a plume of smoke. What's under the ugly suit? Jonathan looked back at his son sleeping in the truck. Then he looked at the rusted steel. Uncut 1973 Ford Broncos, Jonathan whispered. Greg choked on his smoke, coughing violently. He stared at Jonathan, then at the hideous, bloated fiberglass block on the flatbed. Bullshit. An original uncut early Bronco frame is... Artie, people pay 50 grand just for a rolling chassis with a clean VIN. I know, Jonathan said, the tightness in his chest easing just a fraction. There are 17 of them here. But the titles are salvage, no keys, and you don't even know if the frames are rusted through. I checked the undercarriage of the first one in the mud, Jonathan said. Surface rust. The fiberglass shells protected them from the rain. They're time capsules. Across town, Vivian Croft was standing in her penthouse apartment, pouring a heavy measure of Lagavulin into a crystal glass. The city stretched out beneath her, a grid of glittering lights and organized efficiency. Her apartment was a masterpiece of modern minimalism, concrete, glass, and stark white leather. It was perfectly silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. She took a sip of the scotch. The peat and smoke burned her throat in a satisfying way. She looked at her phone. An email from her acquisitions team confirmed the industrial lot was fully cleared. She thought of the man in the dirty canvas jacket. Jonathan Paul. She hated that he had lingered in her mind. It was the look in his eyes that bothered her. Most people she crushed in business looked away. They cowered. They made excuses. Jonathan had just looked at her shoes, stated a fact, and walked away. There was a quiet dignity to him that stood in stark contrast to his financial reality. Vivian walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She had fought her way out of a childhood defined by lack. Her father had been a man of dreams and no execution, always chasing the next big score while the electricity got shut off. She despised people who gambled their security on junk. Jonathan Paul was exactly like her father, a fool throwing away his rent money on rusty metal. She took another sip of scotch, letting the warmth settle in her stomach. She had been right to mock him. It was a harsh world, and the sooner people like him learned that magic beans didn't exist, the better. Still, as she turned off the lights and walked to her massive, empty bed, the silence of the penthouse felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the image of his bloodied, greased knuckles and the sheer, immovable certainty in his tired voice. They have good bones. Vivian pulled the heavy duvet over herself. Garbage, she whispered to the empty room. The air in the storage yard smelled of rotting leaves, diesel fuel, and raw anticipation. It was a Saturday morning, a week after the auction. The rain had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, biting cold that turned Jonathan's breath into white plumes. He was standing in front of vehicle number 1. Toby was sitting on an overturned bucket a few feet away, wrapped in a thick, puffy coat, playing with a battered tablet. "Dad, it smells bad." "I know, buddy. It's just old air." "It's been trapped for a long time," Jonathan said, adjusting his safety glasses. He had spent the last 4 evenings, after his shift at the auto shop, taking a reciprocating saw to the fiberglass shell. It was brutal, back-breaking work. The fiberglass dust clung to his sweat, itching terribly, and the saw blades dulled quickly against hidden steel rivets. But piece by piece, the ugly, bloated exterior fell away. Now, the final panel of the aftermarket shell lay on the gravel. Beneath it sat a 1973 Ford Bronco. It wasn't pretty. The original factory paint, a faded, chalky seafoam green, was marred by scratches and heavy surface oxidation. The interior was a disaster of cracked vinyl and mouse nests. But as Jonathan walked around it, running his bare, calloused hand over the rear quarter panels, his heart hammered against his ribs. The wheel wells were pristine, uncut. In the off-road community, finding an early Bronco that hadn't had its fenders brutally sawed off to fit oversized mud tires was like finding a unicorn. And the frame rails beneath, while coated in a thick layer of brown scale, felt solid to the tap of a hammer. No soft spots, no rot. Jonathan popped the hood. The latch screamed in protest, requiring a heavy shot of penetrating oil before it finally gave way. He propped it open. There it was, the 302 cubic inch V8. It was covered in 20 years of grime, leaves, and a massive spider web. But it was all there, all original. "Okay," Jonathan whispered to himself. "Let's see if you have a pulse." He went to work. His movements were methodical, a practiced choreography born of 20 years under the hood. He pulled the spark plugs, finding them black but intact. He squirted Marvel mystery oil directly into the cylinders to lubricate the rings that had been dry for decades. He drained the oil pan. The sludge that came out looked like black molasses and smelled of burnt coffee. He replaced the filter, poured in fresh, golden oil, and hooked up a high-capacity marine battery he'd brought from the shop. He bypassed the rotten fuel tank entirely, running a rubber hose from the mechanical fuel pump directly into a red plastic jerry can filled with premium gasoline. "Toby, cover your ears, buddy," Jonathan called out. He sprayed a generous shot of starting fluid straight down the throat of the carburetor. He walked around to the driver's side, reached through the open window, and grabbed the key he had painstakingly hot-wired an ignition bypass for. He turned the cylinder. The starter motor whined, a slow, agonizing roar, roar, roar that sounded like a dying animal. The battery cables grew hot. Jonathan held his breath. Come on. He pumped the gas pedal twice. He hit the starter again. Roar, 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 pop. A backfire echoed through the yard like a gunshot. Toby jumped, giggling. Jonathan adjusted the choke, sprayed one more hit of ether, and turned the switch. The engine caught. It was violent and uneven. The V8 roared to life, shaking violently on its mounts. A massive cloud of thick, acrid black smoke blasted out of the rusted tailpipe, carrying with it chunks of dry rot and soot. The noise was deafening, a mechanical clatter of dry lifters and rough bearings. But it ran. Jonathan stepped back, his eyes watering from the exhaust fumes. He watched the engine idle, smoothing out slowly as the fresh oil circulated. The aggressive, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the classic American Phi-8 echoing off the storage unit doors. He felt a wetness on his cheeks that wasn't from the smoke. He wiped his face with a dirty sleeve. He had done it. He had actually done it. That night, Jonathan took 5 high-resolution photos of the running chassis, focusing on the uncut fenders, the clear VIN plate, and the engine bay. He posted them on a private, high-end classic car restoration forum with a simple caption, 1973 uncut Bronco. Running chassis, cleaned up, salvage title but clear numbers. 1 of 17 available, taking offers. He hit submit, closed his laptop, and went to make Toby a grilled cheese sandwich. By Monday morning, Vivian Croft was in a foul mood. She was sitting at the head of a long mahogany conference table in Croft Omnicorp's downtown headquarters. The server farm project on the newly acquired lot was already running into zoning issues. The city was demanding a new environmental impact study because of some supposed soil contamination from the previous owner. "It's a delay of 3 months, Miss Croft," her lead architect explained, looking nervously at his tablet. "And the holding costs for the land during the delay will eat into our Q3 margins significantly." Vivian rubbed her temples. "Fix it. Bribe a city councilman with a charitable donation. Fast-track the soil removal. I don't care. Just get shovels in the dirt." She stood up, dismissing the room. She needed air. She needed to be around people who actually got things done. An hour later, she pushed through the glass doors of Apex Customs, a high-end automotive restoration boutique in the Pearl District. The owner, a man named Marcus. Wait, no. A man named Julian. No, she corrected her internal monologue. A man named Silas. No, let's call him Bennett. Bennett wiped his hands on a clean microfiber towel as Vivian walked in. The shop floor looked like an operating room filled with vintage Porsches and Ferraris torn down to their bare metal. Vivian came here occasionally. She appreciated the absolute control these mechanics exerted over their machines. It was soothing. Vivian, Bennett smiled, stepping out from behind a pristine 1960s Jaguar. To what do I owe the pleasure? You finally ready to let me build you that custom Defender? I need a distraction, Bennett. Something aggressive. Maybe a vintage G-Wagon. Bennett chuckled, walking over to an espresso machine in the corner. You and every other tech CEO in the valley. I can't keep up with the demand for vintage SUVs, specifically early Broncos. They are the new gold standard for the billionaire boys club. I have guys offering 80 grand just for a rusted out frame so we can build them a $250,000 resto mod. Vivian accepted the small porcelain cup of espresso. So, buy more. You can't just buy them, Vivian. They're extinct. Uncut originals simply don't exist anymore. Bennett paused, taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes gleaming with industry gossip. Well, that was true until yesterday. Vivian frowned, taking a sip of the bitter espresso. What happened yesterday? The craziest barn-find drop in a decade, Bennett said, leaning against his workbench. Some guy on the coast just flooded the private forums. He found 17 uncut early 70s Broncos. They were hidden under ugly fiberglass tour bus shells for 20 years. Complete ghost fleet. Vivian's hand froze halfway to her mouth. The espresso cup felt suddenly very hot. Tour bus shells? Vivian asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Yeah. Looked like blocky minivans. He bought the whole lot blind at some foreclosure auction. Paid next to nothing. Rumor is he got the entire fleet for a couple of grand. Bennett laughed, shaking his head. The guy is a genius. I already wired him a deposit for 3 of them. $50,000 a pop, as is. Vivian set the cup down. It rattled slightly against the saucer. $50,000. For one, she did the math in her head, the numbers flashing with brutal clarity. 17 vehicles, $850,000, nearly $1 million in pure equity. Who? Vivian asked. Her throat felt tight. The smell of the rich espresso suddenly made her nauseous. Who is the seller? Bennett pulled out his phone, scrolling for a second before turning the screen toward her. Some independent mechanic. Name is Jonathan Paul. Vivian stared at the screen. It was a picture of the same exhausted man in the dirty canvas jacket, standing proudly next to a stripped-down seafoam green chassis. He was smiling. It wasn't an arrogant smile. It was the smile of a man who could finally breathe. Vivian felt a cold knot form in the pit of her stomach. She heard her own voice echoing in her memory, sharp and cruel in the freezing rain. It's decisions like this that keep people exactly where they are. She looked down at her $3,000 shoes. For the first time in her life, she felt incredibly, stupidly cheap. The rain returned on Tuesday, a relentless, freezing downpour that drummed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of Vivian's corner office. She stood watching the water distort the city skyline, her reflection a pale ghost hovering over the wet concrete below. On her desk sat a revised financial forecast for the new distribution hub. The soil contamination remediation was going to cost $4 million and delay construction by 6 months. It was a massive hit. Yet what gnawed at her stomach wasn't the corporate loss. It was the fact that a man in a greasy canvas jacket had pulled nearly $1 million out of that exact same dirt, right under her nose. She turned away from the window, her jaw tight. She picked up her desk phone. David, find out where Jonathan Paul is storing those vehicles. Don't call him. Just get me an address. 2 hours later, Vivian was driving herself. She had left the Maybach in the corporate garage and taken her personal vehicle, a slate-grey Porsche Panamera. She needed to feel the wheel in her hands. She needed to be the one in control. The storage yard was located behind a dying strip mall on the outskirts of the city, flanked by a discount liquor store and a boarded-up laundromat. The pavement gave way to deeply rutted gravel. Vivian winced as the undercarriage of the Porsche scraped against a submerged rock. She parked near the chain-link gate and cut the engine. The rhythmic, high-pitched scream of an angle grinder pierced the damp air. Vivian stepped out into the drizzle, pulling the collar of her trench coat up against the chill. The yard smelled of wet earth, atomized metal, and the sharp, chemical tang of spray primer. Under a large, sagging canvas canopy, Jonathan was bent over a chassis. The ugly fiberglass shell was gone. He was wearing a welding mask, showering the damp gravel in a brilliant, cascading arc of orange sparks. A few feet away, beneath the dry center of the canopy, his son Toby was sitting at a folding card table, carefully coloring in a textbook. Vivian hesitated. The impulse to turn around and leave was overwhelming, but her ego, a rigid and demanding master, forced her feet forward. Her heels crunched loudly on the gravel. Jonathan stopped grinding. He lifted the mask, wiping a streak of black soot across his forehead with the back of his wrist. He didn't look surprised to see her. He just looked tired, though the crushing, desperate exhaustion from the auction seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. He set the heavy grinder down on a milk crate and let the silence stretch. "Mr. Paul," Vivian said, stopping at the edge of the canopy. The rain dripped off the brim of her coat. "Ms. Croft," Jonathan replied. His voice was flat, devoid of the deference she was used to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a rag, slowly wiping grease from his split knuckles. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Did I leave a rusty fender on your lot?" Vivian swallowed. The air here felt thick, heavy with the reality of physical labor. It made her own world of spreadsheets and boardrooms feel strangely hollow. No, the lot was cleared up perfectly. "Thank you," she forced the words out. They tasted like ash. "I'm here because I made a miscalculation regarding the asset class you purchased. I'm told you uncovered 17 early model Broncos." 16, actually, Jonathan corrected mildly. "One of the frames was bent beyond repair. Scrapped it yesterday." 16, then. Vivian squared her shoulders, slipping back into the comfortable armor of negotiation. "I'm currently having a custom vehicle built by Apex Customs. The owner informed me of your windfall. I want to buy one of the chassis, directly from you. I'm prepared to offer $60,000. That's 20% above the market rate you've established." Jonathan looked at her. He didn't blink. He didn't widen his eyes at the number. He just stared at her the exact same way he had on the day of the auction. "They're spoken for," he said quietly. "Everyone has a price, Jonathan," Vivian countered, her tone hardening. She hated being told no. "If you've already taken deposits, refund one. Tell the buyer a frame turned out to be rusted. I'll make it $70,000. Cash wire today." Jonathan tossed the dirty rag onto the workbench. He took a step toward her. He was taller than she remembered, and the physical proximity made her acutely aware of how out of place she was. "You think this is about money for me?" Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a low, rough register. You think I'm holding out for a better number? Because that's how your world works, right? Everything is a commodity, including pride. It's a business transaction, Vivian said defensively, crossing her arms. No, it isn't. Jonathan gestured toward the rusted skeleton of the truck. When you looked at me on that lot, you didn't just see a bad investment. You saw a loser. You stood there in your expensive coat and laughed at a man who was drowning. You wanted me to drown so you could feel smart about standing on dry land. Vivian flinched. The words hit her physically, a punch to the chest. She wanted to argue, to deploy her sharp intellect and cut him down, but she couldn't find the breath. I sold the last chassis this morning, Jonathan continued, his eyes locked onto hers. All 16 are gone, paid in full. But even if I had one left, I wouldn't sell it to you. Not for 70,000, not for 100,000. Why? Vivian snapped, her composure cracking. Because you want to punish me? That's terrible business. Jonathan shook his head, a sad, brief smile touching his lips. Because you don't want the truck, Vivian. You just want to buy back the feeling of being right. You want to own the thing that proved you wrong, so you can lock it in a garage and pretend you never made a mistake. He turned his back on her, reaching for the heavy angle grinder. I have work to do, Ms. Croft. Please don't block the gate on your way out. The grinder roared to life, screaming against the steel. The shower of sparks returned, a brilliant barrier of fire and noise that completely shut her out. Vivian stood in the rain for a long moment, the cold seeping through her expensive wool before turning and walking back to her car. She didn't slam the door. She just sat in the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, staring out at the grey, indifferent sky. 30 days. That was the deadline Vivian had originally given Jonathan to clear the lot. 30 days to fail. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the final transport truck backed into Jonathan's gravel yard. The air was dry and bitterly cold. Greg was standing by the gate, nursing a styrofoam cup of black coffee, watching as the hydraulic lift leveled out. That's the last of them, Artie, Greg said, his breath pluming in the air. 16 ghosts, resurrected and shipped out. You actually pulled it off, you crazy son of a bitch. Jonathan stood next to him, his hands shoved deep into his canvas jacket pockets. The jacket was still stained with grease, his boots were still scuffed. But his posture had fundamentally changed. The permanent, defensive hunch of a man waiting for the next disaster to strike was gone. He stood straight. Yeah, Jonathan said softly. He didn't cheer. He didn't pop champagne. The victory was entirely internal. His bank account held slightly over $800,000. He had already paid off his debts. He had fully funded a specialized health savings account for Toby's asthma, completely covering a lifetime of inhalers and treatments. And yesterday, he had signed the deed to a modest, functional 3-bay garage on the east side of town. It wasn't a luxury shop. It was cinder block and concrete, but the roof didn't leak. And his name was on the title. So what now? Greg asked, bumping his shoulder against Jonathan's. You gonna buy a boat? Move to Hawaii? Jonathan looked over at Toby, who was throwing rocks at a rusty hubcap near the fence. I'm gonna buy a new set of socket wrenches, Jonathan said, a genuine smile finally breaking across his face. The good ones, the ones that don't strip out the bolts. And maybe we'll get pizza tonight. The place with the arcade in the back. Across the city, Vivian Croft was standing in her penthouse, looking out over the grid of streets. The zoning issue on the distribution hub had finally been resolved. Her team had thrown enough money at the city council to make the soil contamination problem disappear into a bureaucratic filing cabinet. Construction was slated to begin on Monday. Her board of directors had sent her an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate the strategic navigation of local hurdles. The bottle sat unopened on her kitchen island. The penthouse was impeccably clean. The thermostat was set to a perfect 72 degrees. The air smelled of nothing. Vivian walked over to the island and ran her fingers over the cold marble countertop. She had spent her entire life building walls. She had amassed wealth not to buy things, but to buy distance. Distance from the panic of her childhood. Distance from failure. Distance from people who made messy, emotional, human mistakes. She thought she had won the game. But as she stood in the deafening silence of her multi-million-dollar fortress, she realized a terrifying truth. She was completely alone. She remembered the look in Jonathan's eyes at the storage yard. He wasn't angry. He pitied her. A man who, a month ago, had $2,500 to his name and mud on his boots, had looked at a billionaire and felt sorry for her. He had family. He had a friend who stood in the freezing rain to help him turn wrenches. He had the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who knew the texture of the dirt and wasn't afraid to get his hands in it. Vivian poured herself a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. She walked over to her designer coat rack. She bypassed the tailored camel hair coat and pulled down a plain, dark windbreaker. She grabbed her keys, leaving the Maybach fob behind, and took the elevator down to the garage. An hour later, Vivian was parked in her Porsche, a block away from a newly purchased cinderblock auto shop on the east side. The bay doors were open. Warm yellow light spilled out onto the cracked sidewalk. She rolled her window down just an inch. The cold evening air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of motor oil, roasting pizza, and the sharp, sudden sound of a child's laughter. She could see Jonathan inside, wiping down a workbench. Greg was sitting on a tire, eating a slice of pizza. Toby was running around a vintage car chassis, making engine noises with his mouth. Vivian watched them for a long time. She watched the easy camaraderie, the unforced warmth that filled the dirty concrete room. It was a kind of wealth she didn't know how to acquire. There was no spreadsheet for it, no corporate takeover strategy that could seize it. She reached up and pressed the button to roll the window back up, sealing out the noise and the cold. The cabin of the Porsche returned to its sterile, silent perfection. Vivian put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading back toward the skyline. She didn't cry. She wasn't the type. But as she drove back to her empty penthouse, the leather steering wheel felt heavier than it ever had before, and the city lights looked less like a kingdom she had conquered, and more like a grid of cold, distant stars. Value isn't what a billionaire tells you it is. It's what you build with your own bare hands when everyone else thinks you've lost your mind. Jonathan didn't just rebuild rusted metal. He rebuilt his life, while the woman who mocked him was left holding nothing but her ego. If this story hit home for you, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded stories, and share this with someone who knows the true meaning of hustle. See you next time.